name is Jana, and I was raised in the Midwest in Oklahoma and Texas. Went to school in Texas. My first career was as a speech pathologist. I worked with people who had voice problems with their voice box. Pursued a career through the Mayo Clinic. Lived in the Upper Midwest, and then found my way to Atlanta and furthered my career here in speech pathology until, believe it or not, until I was in my 40s. And in my 40s, I really felt a real burden for truth and the compromise of truth in culture as well as in the church. At that time, it was around the time of the emergent church movement. And so I was also leading groups of seekers to try to figure out what Christianity was about. And I was not very well versed in worldviews outside of Christianity, and I felt the weight of that I wanted to be able to answer more substantially. So in 2004, I went to Biola and started their master's degree in Christian Apologetics. And I graduated from there in 2007. And then I was recruited, I guess you could say, to join with the C.S. Lewis Institute here in Atlanta. They have a fellows program that's bent towards spiritual formation and apologetics. And I worked with that, trying to get the women's portion of that program going. But my heart was really towards apologetics and teaching and helping people understand worldview. So I became a teaching fellow for the C.S. Lewis Institute in Atlanta, and then taught and engaged in apologetics teaching for quite a while. And then I felt the urge, and this will lead into my talk. After being in the apologetics world for several years and watching the arguments and the evidence go back and forth, and really looking at two sides of the argument, naturalism and Christianity most often, looking at the same piece of evidence, becoming to very different conclusions. And there seemed to be very little convincing, especially from the atheist side, to come to the Christian side. I was thinking to myself, what in the world would it take? I mean, if the evidence is so convincing on the Christian worldview, why are they not just all jumping boat? So I wanted to take a closer look at that. I was reading the works of Blaise Pascal and thinking about the passions and the reasons. And of course, we don't hold our beliefs for just rational reasons. And I wanted to take that and look at it more closely. To see what else is involved in the forming of the beliefs, our beliefs, and what it takes to change a belief, and exactly what does it take for an atheist to come to faith in Christianity. I wanted to understand the big picture a little bit better. So that's what drove me to a PhD program, and I pursued that through the University of Birmingham in England. It seemed to fit well with who I was and who they were, and the flexibility with that. And I started that in 2013. And I just graduated from there in 2019. So I'm less than a year of formally graduated, but I feel like I've lived with this for quite a long time. And in the meantime, I've also become an adjunct professor for Biola. I teach their online cultural apologetics. So I think those two things kind of marry very well in terms of looking at things more holistically, culturally, individually, socially, and all of those things. So what I'd like to do for you today is look at this phenomenon, which seems so rare, of atheist conversions to Christianity, and give you kind of an inside peek, and you again tell you a little bit of some of the findings that I've had, some of the insights that I've gained from the study, and tell you a few stories that might give you some idea of how these things actually happen. So we'll do that. Any questions before we dive in? Are we good? Okay, feel free to speak up. And this research study is on. I conducted it with 50 former atheists who become Christians. They had two parts. Basically, one is that they had to fill out an online survey, and I wanted to know everything from their course of their thoughts about atheism, their coming to become open towards something else, and then on towards conversion, from many different perspectives. And then I after I got their survey, then I individually interviewed them to get their stories. They are from Western culture, and I particularly wanted those conversion stories that were within Western culture because of the increasing sense of secularization in the culture, although it's not particularly so, but the sensibility of secularization in these cultures, as well as the increasing marginalization of Christianity. And I wanted to see what it would take for someone who was a convinced atheist to come to the side of Christianity. The one thing that they had to agree to basically was they had to qualify by... Speak up a little bit? Is that okay? The one thing that they had to qualify to do, or to qualify for the study, is to have seen themselves as a naturalistic brand of atheist. That is, only the natural world exists, nothing supernatural exists. So they couldn't have been like a Buddhist form of atheism. They had to be a naturalistic form of atheist who had, in their view, come to faith in Jesus Christ and become a Christian. So that was the only qualifier. It turned out that the group that I got, however, was a highly educated group. It was a group that had 40% had graduate degrees. 7 of those were PhDs. So in terms of a demographic of atheists, these are those who are even beyond the normal demographic of atheism, at least within Western culture. And I think as Christians, this speaks or bodes well for the Christian worldview, because this particular demographic, they were not those who were easily duped by religious superstition. They were more thoughtful and considered by nature, more prone to think more clearly about their own worldview. They were predominantly male, a 4-to-1 ratio, as compared to normal demographics of atheism in the West. It's more of a 2-to-1 rather than a 4-to-1.
Jana,
yes.
How did you find these people?
That is a good question, because I didn't know anyone except, the well-knowns who have books out. So the way that I want to say it, since you're Christians, is that I really didn't know anyone. I just felt led to do this, and it was almost as if the Lord said, "Put your net on this side of the boat, and I'll fill it up." I did look online for stories, for Facebook, articles, blogs. There were some very, very generous people in the philosophy and apologetics world who used their connections. Paul Copan was extraordinarly generous. One of the great catches, I guess you could say, that I received was through Brian Otten of Apologetics 315, that podcast. He had actually formulated a whole spreadsheet of former atheists for a study he was going to do like 3 years prior, but it didn't get done. And it was like a gift he handed to me. So it was a combination of a lot of different things. But because many came from that apologetics sourcing, I think that's why I had such a high level of educated atheists in my group. Oh, oh, what that prior slide was, I don't know if I can do that. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry. The prior slide showed that in terms of a demographic relating to how much exposure they had had to Christianity, 53% had had little to no exposure to Christianity in their life, in their culture, in their background. So most of the messaging that they were getting about who Christians were, what Christianity was through culture, media, news outlets, social media, education. Um, and then about 25% were had some kind of vague some kind of nominal experience with Christianity. It might have been a Christmas, Easter kind of experience growing up. Perhaps they went with their grandparent a few times when they were a child. Only 18% had some kind of active Christian upbringing, whether it be Catholic or Protestant. But just because they were a part of a tradition didn't mean that they necessarily believed. There were only 4 people, I would say, who would consider themselves Christian before they lost their faith to atheism. So for the most part, it was a very strong sense of atheism informed by culture and education and society rather than any kind of real direct experience. And I think that has something to do with what they find when they actually find something authentic. The average age of identification of atheism was around 15. And that's not surprising when people are coming of age, thinking, trying to become independent and thinking through things on their own, and just wanting to live their own life without a lot of restrictions. Although some in my study actually just grew up thinking they were atheists. They just put 0 because they couldn't think of themselves any other way. But the average age of conversion was actually at age 26 when they were young adults. In terms of the kind or type of atheists that were in the study, it ranged all the way from what we consider atheists all the way to the anti-theists, all the way on the right-hand side. And those are the minorities. About 33% are what I would consider weak, or that they said they lacked a belief in God. Maybe they were just careful with their words because they know, it really is hard to disprove God, but 2/3 of them basically said that they knew that God did not exist. And so that I put them in a stronger category. But for the most part, the primary focus of the study was to really look at what were the motivations that shaped the atheistic beliefs. What were the motivations that opened the door towards another way of thinking about reality and thinking about Christianity? And then what were the ways and means in which the Lord actually ended up, bringing them on into conversion unto Him. And I tried to basically separate it into 2 primary categories, and then one of, did rational belief or spiritual belief have something to do with the transition, or was it merely for just, it felt good, it sounded good, I know someone who belonged? Because in reality, most people across the board, no matter what the faith is, most people say no to religious conversion, period, because it's just resistance is the typical response, according to the leading researcher in the field, Louis Rambo. But in terms of how atheists view religion or view religious conversion, most of them, along with the academy, or as you probably very well know, think that religion is just merely a matter of function. It does something for the individual. They go to religion because it does something for them socially. They have a place to belong. It gives them emotional comfort. It gives them a psychological crutch. It gives them a positive experience. There's some functional reasons why people run to religion. But in terms of what it is, that there's a real ontological essence to God, that he really exists. There's no there for them, of course. There's nothing intellectual, that's viable. There's no real reason, there's no real evidence, there's nothing spiritual, of course, because nothing supernatural exists. So although the Christian would contend for the viability, the veracity of the Christian worldview, the atheist would say, no, that's just fiction. It's story. It's fairy tale. It's just a psychological crutch. There's no real or true God. And in fact, it's not even good to believe, and nor is it even relevant. So there becomes this very strong sensibility, almost a dichotomy of the way that atheists view Christians and Christianity or religious belief, that they are the ones who believe in science, not religion. They believe in fact, not fiction. They're the rational, the adults in the room, not the irrational and childish. And there's this sense that, oh, grow up. In my survey, as atheists, 72% thought that Christians were irrational, deluded people, and 60% thought that Christians were weak and needy people. Probably one of the most telling responses is when I asked them to give different, check different boxes about who did you perceive the Christian to be. One was educated, one was, not educated or uneducated. Not one person selected that Christians were educated people. There's a very strong sensibility that atheism is a mature perspective for strong adults. Religion is for weak children and old ladies. They just don't have the intellectual honesty and guts. They have to rely on religion to get them through life. That Christians are hypocritical, they're intolerant, extreme, uneducated, irrelevant, all of those stereotypes that we hear. And so that there's this gross blanket of a negative stereotype overlaid upon religion generally and Christianity specifically. One of the guys in my study, he was from Australia, and he had no reference for Christianity except for what he saw on television. So when this was his go-to. Christians are like Ned Flanders. And that's not a real positive way of viewing Christians, but that was not unusual thinking in their minds. So what happens is, and as Christians we're aware of this, is that there becomes a lack of plausibility in culture, intellectually, scientifically, socially, culturally, and such that you don't even have to take whatever they're offering seriously, that you can just dismiss it out of hand. C.S. Lewis says the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones being argued, but the ones that are being assumed. Because you can just dismiss without really even consideration. And Os Guinness calls our culture, the culture in the West at the moment, the ABC moment. It's just anything but Christianity. And so what happens is that there is, again, that automatic dismissal because of this loss of plausibility. And I think, Casper, I believe you were asking me or someone about the new atheists, and that's what the game plan is if you can ridicule and dismiss, then you don't have to deal with the ideas. And so that it's really, really tough to move against so much fight on that. So then the atheists make themselves out to be the plausible ones, right? If you say, why don't you believe in God? The first response is a very rational response. It's a scientific response. It's they are the reasoned ones. They are the brights. So, and there is this dismissal, this contempt and dismissal and ridicule so that you don't have to deal with the Christian. But if we look behind the curtain, granted, I do want to say that atheists, generally speaking, do have some real intellectual reasons and rationality and doubts, and they have their case. But if we look very closely, we can see that there are obviously other reasons for their atheism. And sometimes, if they present with rational reasons for their disbelief, we're only going to play with them on that playground. But we need to really appreciate the fact that there are a lot of reasons why people don't believe in God, intellectual reasons being one of a part of a whole, of a picture of disbelief. Does anybody want to say anything, ask anything before I move forward here?
Yes, I wanted to ask a question. How many of these people that you interviewed converted back to atheism?
I actually interviewed 52, and one of those went back to atheism and then came back to Christianity, but he was not included in my study.
Okay.
All of these had maintained a pretty steady Christian faith from the time that they converted. The strength of their Christianity and conversion was phenomenal. It was almost as if the height of their resistance was matched with the passion of their Christianity. Truly, as if they had gone from darkness to light, dead to life. And it truly inspirational people. These are movers and shakers in the kingdom. I mean, I could go on about that, and if we have time, I can tell you a little bit more. But no, none of them, except for that one, kind of wavered back and forth. But none of these had ever went back.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Curious.
Yes.
Where do you put into the formula, if there is one that we're talking about,
Yes.
the the drawing of the Holy Spirit, in that if the Lord doesn't drag them to salvation, then they will never be born again?
Well, I will say that, and it's interesting, because I believe that the Lord is in this from beginning to end. I would say that conversion doesn't happen without the work of God and the Holy Spirit, that it just is not possible. But I will tell you that there are those in the study that lean more towards Calvinism because of that. There's one guy in the study who was from France, who just life was totally good. He had everything in the world, wealthy family. He was tall, he was educated, he had everything in the world he wanted. And he was brought to faith through a very, like when you have everything in the world that you could possibly imagine, you are the happy atheist, no despair, nothing like that. The only thing that would turn his head would be a beautiful woman. And he met some girl on a vacation and decided to dismantle her Christianity so that he could sleep with her, to be quite honest. And so he went through this very interesting journey. He's still incredibly successful, but he also holds a PhD in theology. But he would tell you that his brother, who knows the same thing, wasn't picked out in such an unusual way. I mean, that when you hear his story, there are very, very providential things in his storyline that you just go, wow, how did that happen? It would not have happened unless. And so, yes, I want to say that the Spirit is involved all the way through, but again, that's a theological issue in terms of how much, is it, total depravity, or, did they have anything to say about their own, their own walk and realization, the way that the Lord led them? I don't know. And I'm not the one to say that. All I can say is that I will say that the Holy Spirit was in and over and above and superintending and changing and showing up. When God, people called out to God, he was there, and just amazing and providential circumstances. And it's clear to see the hand of God in these stories, and I want to emphasize that. But I also want to say that of course there was some, I don't want to get into a theological discussion here, but there were choices that were made, choices about their lives and choices one way or another. And but anyway, but God's hand is shown all the way through. I'm going to continue on for just a moment, and we'll continue with questions as we go. But of course, there are intellectual reasons for disbelief, but there are other reasons for why we hold certain beliefs and reject others, and that has to do some, of course, with the home that we're raised in, the family that we're brought up in, the exposure that we have, the friends that we have, our family, our society, our community, our culture, again, social media, broad media, the films and art, everything. We have a lot of voices speaking into us that can affirm or disaffirm the things that we believe. There are also reasons we hold belief, that are experiential and emotional in nature. If we're like that guy I was telling you about, he's a very happy atheist. He had good positive experiences in life. He had no felt need for God. There was nothing in him that desired God. It was not something, he just wanted to dismantle it. But there are those who have negative experiences in life, just generally speaking, perhaps, the child of an alcoholic parent, or a tragic event in someone's life, or a negative encounter or experience with a religious person or a religious institution. There are all kinds of things that shape our belief for or against God. Our sense of self, our identity, our sense of who we are, that we're like too smart for that, too scientific. I can't be a scientist and believe in religion. I'm the captain of my own ship. I make my own rules. I don't want that to be true. I don't want anything to be over my life. So there are a lot of different reasons why we form and shape beliefs and why we say no to God. But generally speaking, if I had to put them in categories, I've really come to look at the stories and the sensibilities and the pushback of, that God's not real, God's not true. Those are two different things. God, the concept of God isn't true, and the Christian worldview is not true, or God isn't real. There's no supernatural reality to him, and those are two different things. That God's not good, and Christians aren't good, that God's not relevant. And so you'll see kind of the way that I tease it out in looking at it through those lenses. It may not just be one, it may be all of the above, but there are different reasons why we disbelieve in God in their own view. When I separated out the motives or the influences between, again, those which I felt were substantive in nature, that is rational, intellectual, and or spiritual, that God's not true or real, and then I divided the other more functional motivations. And so the top reasons why people said in the survey why they didn't believe in God, I thought it was interesting that the most the highest response was lack of personal evidence for God. Well, of course, that's not an objective piece of evidence. That's a subjective, personal kind of evidence, that I don't see or feel God. And as Christians representing God, there's something to be said about why people are or are not feeling the presence of God in their life. And that's something that we, in a living apologetic, can have something to do with. But of course, there were there's the lack of evidence, philosophical, scientific, irrationality of belief. It doesn't seem to line up with science. But in terms of the top reasons why they thought God wasn't, that they didn't believe in God, is for religious hypocrisy, or a lack of exposure, basically that they'd met a Christian, didn't like it, or they had met a Christian and they had no understanding of really what Christianity was, or what who Christ was. Of course, a lot of unwillingness, didn't want it, they didn't like it because of the moral constraints, and they just didn't have a felt need of it. So again, all different kinds of reasons for disbelief. When I kind of broke them down in terms of the more substantive, very few disbelieved in God for only substantive reasons. A few more didn't believe because God wasn't good or relevant, but it had nothing to do with the intellect or intellectual rational reasons. But for the most part, it was a combination that God isn't real, he's not true, he's not good, it's not relevant. It's kind of a mixed bag of why the disbelief. But at the end of the day, whatever the reason for disbelief, nearly 2/3 said it didn't matter. No evidence would be sufficient to convince them of other than their atheism. That's an interesting statement, an interesting finding, because it really begs the question, if no evidence would be sufficient to convince them otherwise, what about intellectual honesty? Are they really being honest with their atheistic worldview? It also answers the question that sometimes we can put evidence in front of them, but it really doesn't matter because they have predetermined that they're not going to be convinced by it. So it's a matter of the will. But the other thing, as I was thinking about this is really kind of an interesting and encouraging statistic, because think about it, those nearly 2/3 who had this very, very strong sensibility of disbelief, like no way ever would I ever change, now find themselves as very strongly believing Christians. So it really speaks to the fact that you never know. No one is too far from the Father's reach. I mean, it's just amazing. But in terms of, again, in their own view, their openness towards Christianity was very, very limited, whether it be intellectually, emotionally, socially, or morally. Very few. 12% said they were open, they wanted to believe, but they couldn't. So again, that's a very, very small percentage. So that begs the million-dollar question. So if they're that strong of an atheist, what happened? What happened that made them change their mind, open the door, and consider something else? And then what brought them on to conversion? Thoughts, questions before we move forward?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got kicked out and I came back, but what was the age? I'm sure you probably had it up. I'm sorry. The age group for the 50 people, it was like mixed.
The age group, yeah, they ranged. Oh goodness, I don't know exactly. I would say it's been a while since I've read that, but anywhere from say 20 to early 70s. It was quite a broad range, as well as the time post-conversion. So some had converted within, say, a year to 4 years, and some had converted as long as like 42 years. So there was quite a diversity in terms of age and time post-conversion.
Yeah, because I was thinking, because like I know being in like I graduated like 5 years ago, and I noticed, like, I guess once young adults kind of go into college, that's kind of when they kind of walk away from the faith, I guess. Like after, I mean, some in high school, but it's like, I guess for Christians, like they are in school, elementary school, high school, and then they're not really as challenged as when they're in college. And so typically when I go to church, I see like either like older and children and not much in between. So I don't know if there was like a demographic of a certain age.
Well, I think, I don't know if you got this, but the average age of of religious conversion for these people was at 26. So yeah, it seemed that they left, if they didn't leave in there, well, they left whatever potential there was for Christianity around the age of 15. So they left it before they got to college. And of course, this was not a predominantly Christian demographic. It was a mostly none to nominal Christian demographic, but a few who had some kind of like regular experience. But most of them left it before they got to college. I think college just put the nail in the coffin for many. Although, as we've seen, like there are those Christian youth who really kind of go with the flow until they get to college. They've really never given their worldview much consideration, and then it falls apart easily.
So Jana, we have a question here in the chat box. This is from Sarah. She said, was there anyone who converted who had a supernatural experience that was part of their catalyst or conversion?
Yes, and we're going to talk about that. In fact, that's coming up on the next slide. So let me just go there, and I'll talk about the spiritual experiences in 2 of 3 of the stories that I have today for you. But again, the question is, what was the catalyst that caused someone to change, to change course, to start to question things, to start to question their own worldview as well as question Christianity? For about half and half in terms of something sudden that changed in them, or either a realization or an event or an experience perhaps, or but half of them, it was a much more gradual in nature. But it also could have been prompted by something supernatural occurring, or just a natural flow of events. For 14%, that 14% of those in the study had some kind of a spiritual experience, a supernatural encounter with God, with Jesus, a dream, a vision that caused them to stop in their tracks and move forward in an open way, as compared to 37% who said that they had some kind of supernatural or spiritual encountering, if not before, if not as a catalyst or causing conversion, then actually post-conversion, which confirmed their belief. So it was one of the most fascinating findings that I had in my study. Oftentimes I think we think, oh, in third world countries, but here this is kind of an unreached people group in many regards in a secularized society. And so that God shows up in very extraordinary ways and very personal ways. Sarah, why did you ask that? I'm just curious.
Well, just because I guess I have a lot of people who I know who have intellectual objections, but I think for me, supernatural experience was really important in searching for God and finding God. So just curious.
Oh yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I bet you have a great story. But yeah, it's definitely a part of it, and like I say, I'll weave that into some of the stories today. But from a very general point of view, in terms of moving from atheism to some degree of openness, I would say it came from one of 2 directions apart from a supernatural encountering. One is that there is, as atheists, there's a certain expectation of atheism, of what it will bring them, of what it will provide, an intellectual home, that sort of thing, that they have a sense in which it will provide all the answers that they need for not only their intellect, but also for their life, that it gives them, everything think they want and desire, freedom and free moral choices, and I can do things on my own, and I can be respected as a scientist, etc. It just gives you everything. There's a high expectation for atheism, but yet over time there comes a dissatisfaction with it for many. After you've lived with it for a while and you're realizing perhaps the implications of the worldview, perhaps it wasn't as satisfying or as explanatory as you once thought it was. So there are a lot of things that happen in that direction. So there's an expectation and then a lived experience that's disappointing for the atheist. But then conversely, there's an expectation negatively for Christianity. We've talked about that there's such a negative understanding of who Christians are and what Christianity is, that when they experience something other than what they expect, it causes them to stop and to think twice and to perhaps move in a different direction. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say there is that there are these negative stereotypes that are broken, that are somehow broken down with regard to Christianity. And then there is a building up of plausibility. So we're breaking things down and building them up, or the Lord is doing that, really. And it's like Paul is saying, we're tearing down speculations and everything that's held up against the knowledge of God, and then we're taking every thought captive and making it obedient to Christ. So it's that sense of, tearing down and building up. And that's what I've found in this study, is like, atheists were surprised, not only by the lack in their own worldview, but by what they found in the Christian worldview. Does that make sense? Again, for some it was more sudden, others it was a lot more progressive journey. But as you know, particularly as a Christians and apologists, is that both worldviews have to give an explanation for the way things are in reality. In today's world, atheists are trying to dismiss their responsibility for explaining reality. All they have to do is say, I'm scientific, I'm rational, and I lack a belief in God. So they don't feel the burden of proof, but that's being dishonest. Because as you know, every worldview has to give an explanation for what we observe in the cosmos and the physical nature, and what we observe in ourselves in human nature. And so the question is, which worldview gives the best explanation for reality? And for the atheist, is their answers to every question with regard to physical nature and human nature is limited, because every answer has to come from a naturalistic source. Because if ultimate reality is nothing but matter in motion, and the only thing that is reality is a closed naturalistic universe, then every answer for physical nature and who we are in our human nature has to come from that box. And sometimes that reductionistic view of reality can cause problems in their understanding of and trying to make sense of their worldview. Whereas, of course, in the Christian worldview, it's an open universe, so that there is both nature and supernature, or what is supernatural. There's the material and there is the immaterial, so that we can feel free to follow the evidence wherever it leads. If the source or cause is beyond the natural world, then we can find warrant for that in the person of God. So the explanatory power of the Christian worldview seems to be much better, and it seems to make sense of reality as we know it. And again, so when the atheist, his realm of explanation is limited to a reduction that there's nothing but random processes. I can't even see my slide here. The random processes of blind, purposeless processes, random anyway, how do you explain, pardon me, certain things in the world or certain things about their own world? They seem to, as Nancy Pearcey would say, they seem to stick outside the box. Answers to origin, design, information. I remember one of the people in my study was saying, it just didn't make sense to me how something sense of that, or fine tuning or information in the cell. Where does that come from? There's water doesn't rise above its source. You can only gain so much from a naturalistic worldview. It doesn't provide the resources, the explanatory resources for what we're seeing in reality, or of course who they are in their own humanity. If we have to see ourselves as an atheist, they have to see themselves, if they are intellectually honest, as nothing but born of blind, purposeless processes of no inherent dignity or value, that their life has no ultimate meaning, that they can't find objective morality, they can't trust their own rationality, they actually don't even have freedom to choose if they live according to the reality of their own worldview. They have to say it's an illusion. All of these things that I experience in myself, that I'm valuable, that I am seeking after meaning, that I have purpose, that all of those things, that I'm freely choosing what my choices are, those are all illusory. And when you come to grips with that, it's very disconcerting. As Albert Camus says, you must spend your life acting as if life is not absurd. He said life is a bad joke. He called it absurdism. And it causes a dissonance between the things that you say you believe, yet how you live and how you experience reality. And although just as Christians sometimes don't look fully and thoroughly through their own worldview, many of the atheists in my study, some were willing to look more at the implications of their worldview, and some were just not. But at the end of the day, we know that the Christian worldview, it gives us, everything that we need to answer these questions. We may not know them fully, but we have a lot more coherence with, what we know about the world, what we know about ourselves, in terms of the answers that we can provide. It gives a better explanation. It all makes sense. So, but back to the atheists, when I asked them what their primary reasons were for opening themselves towards, or being open towards another point of view, the most common response was tied. The first was to disprove or discredit Christianity. But the second kind of goes along with it, in that, there was something dissatisfying in their own worldview, whether it be intellectually it didn't make sense, or existentially, emotionally, it didn't make sense. But they were willing to go and look at Christianity in order to discredit it before they completely wrote it off. So they're dissatisfied. They know they don't want Christianity, but somehow they've got to disprove it. There's something in them that's like, well, if it's not Christianity, what is it? Or they go through a path of perhaps, I'll do anything but Christianity. Again, some of them went through other spiritual paths before they would come to a place of even looking at Christianity. But for the most part, they just wanted to disprove it, to discredit it. And that's why perhaps they picked up a Bible. That's why they looked more closely at apologetics or debates. But there were those who just admitted they wanted something more in their life, that atheism wasn't providing not only the sense-making element that they thought that they would get, but it doesn't provide the existential satisfaction that they thought it would. And then some of them, had significant relationships that were Christians, and and they maybe went to church with them in order to satisfy a relationship or whatever. But it was something that didn't bring them to Christianity, but it actually opened the door for them to be exposed, perhaps. So again, there are a number of reasons why people reject Christianity, and there are a lot of different reasons why people might become more open towards Christianity. Nobody holds convictions or beliefs in a vacuum. Their convictions are wrapped in a story of how they got there and why they believe what they believe. So the goal for us as Christians is to really kind of get into their story, to really understand the motivations so that you can better understand how to engage with the issues that they're dealing with why they're rejecting Christianity. They may say it's an intellectual reason, but you may be something much deeper. So what I'd like to do, we'll take a brief break and for questions or comments, and then what I'd like to do is look at three primary stories, those of someone who really disbelieved because of God's just not true and more intellectually bent, God's not good, more emotionally bent, and God's not relevant, a more existential story. Any comments before we move forward? Okay. All right, well, we'll just talk about some really great stories. The first one is the one we most often hear, right? There's no evidence for God. God's not true. God's not real. And we're going to talk about Jeremy. Jeremy thought that God was neither true nor real, that God was a psychological crutch, an embarrassing belief, irrelevant, abusive, malevolent, fictional figure. It was a mere social belief. What was Christianity? Christianity for him was dangerous, man-made, judgmental, intolerant, not relevant, false, superstitious ideology. In his own words, it was a mythological zombie story, Jesus dying and rising again. It's a zombie story. It was a wildly incoherent fairy tale, although he admitted in hindsight he just had a bumper sticker understanding of what he thought he knew what Christianity was. So his backstory, yes, he came out very strongly in terms of being intellectual. He was an avid reader. He had read most of the French existentialists by the time he was 14 and declared himself a nihilist. So we're talking about this kind of an intellect. What kind of home did he come from? His father was what he called a highbrow intellectual, a scientist, a chemist. He grew up, instead of having the Bible on the table, he grew up with Carl Sagan's Cosmos. So that was the direction he saw himself in. His mother, on the other hand, was very Oprah-esque, he said, and her spirituality kind of went with wherever the wind blew. They didn't talk about spiritual things or religion at home. It was just kind of a non-issue. His friend and his friend group, he said he had a disproportionate number of antagonistic and atheistic friends who loved to mock and ridicule Christians and loved to tear down street preachers. And anyway, he, in terms of his sense of self, he saw himself again as the smartest guy in the room. He always wanted to be that. He knew growing up, he was a faster learner than most. He said he wasn't athletic, but he loved to compete on the playing ground of ideas. So he was the captain of his debate team. He loved to win an argument. And most of the ideas were really for banter. Although he did, like I say, embrace the concept or self-identity as a nihilist. As an existentialist, as a nihilist. And that was all well and good for a while, as long as it was playing in the realm of ideas. But there was a time, he was a very again, a very thoughtful person in the sense that he loved poetry, he loved music, he loved beauty. He really appreciated those things on a very deep level. So when he started looking more at his own worldview, existentialism and what it held for him, it gave him a sense of despair, existential despair. He was diagnosed with clinical depression. He got into some really dark things. He and his friends were into self-harm and just really heavy music. So it was very difficult for him. At some point, he really felt that although the freedom of existentialism and creating your own reality, it led him to a very dark place. So here he was. He had this superior intellect. He had this sense of dissonance, emotional and cognitive. So it put him in a place, perhaps he came to a place of openness, or at least you could say dissatisfaction. So what was the catalyst that helped him turn the corner? Well, when he was 16, he was at a writer's forum. He loved to write. And so he was at a writer's forum. After one of the events, our meetings, he came out, he had befriended this young woman, and came to find out her father, who came to pick her up, they started having a conversation. He said, "Oh, what do you do?" And the father said, "Well, I'm a philosopher." Well, of course, that piqued his interest. Evidently, he had just come back from Germany, having received his PhD. He had his work was on Immanuel Kant and the philosophy of miracles. And he also worked in the philosophy of science. So meeting someone like that was like a kid in the candy store. He just couldn't believe that he met someone with whom he could go toe-to-toe with philosophically, who actually knew more than he did. And he was so eager to gain knowledge and to have these heady discussions that they set up a weekly philosophy group. So they met together weekly, and what's interesting about this man is that he was a Christian. He had actually studied in Germany at the same time as Greg, and he was not only incredibly intelligent, but he was very wise in the way that he approached Jeremy. And what I mean by that is that they started talking about philosophy, but at no point in at least the first 6 months did he even say, and here's how the Christian worldview can answer that, and here's what I think about that. He just let Jeremy look very deeply at his own worldview until he came to a place where he realized that his own worldview held nothing. And that was very disconcerting for him. But it was only then that Jeremy started asking questions. And he said instead of running away like so many other Christians had done, that he had destroyed in his prior rhetoric, he said this guy actually had answers and gave me ideas and things to think about and books to read. But he said, I was willing to kind of consider Christianity, but I really wasn't willing to go there first. He said, I wanted to explore all the world religions. And so he decided that would be a summer project for him, to disprove all the world religions. But he said something happened in that journeying that moved him from this being just simply an intellectual exercise to the point where he really wanted to know what was true. And so he went on, and he was still discussing with the philosopher. He became very interested in aesthetics and how that was grounded. And there was a day in which his mother actually went to a cigar store to get a cigar for his father because it was his birthday. But what was lying on the shelf there in the shop was a book called The Case for Christ. And the mom was curious. She said, I think my son would like to read this. And the shop owner said, sure, take it. We just have it. He was hosting a group study called Holy Smokes. And that was the book they were reading. But needless to say, the mom took it home. Jeremy picked it up, read it in a weekend, fully with his debater hat on, writing down all of his objections to what he was reading, and then finding answers and being frustrated by it. He said what that book did for him was it didn't convince him, but what it did was it opened him up to pivotal Christian thinkers. He found William Lane Craig in that book, and it led to Alvin Plantinga's work, and it led to Augustine, and just deeper thinking and writing about the Christian worldview. It was like discovering riches that he didn't know that existed, and he said it was a very humbling process that he had to come to grips with all these people had been thinking about all these tremendous things for so long, and he was so unaware of them. But long story short, he came to a place where he felt like there was, at least from a philosophical point of view, from an intellectual point of view, that God probably existed. But he knew that it had to be more than that, that God perhaps was true, but was he real? And he knew there had to be something more to it. So he decided to try on Christianity. He talks about going through this phase of, before I say that, he went through an 18-month period of intense investigation to get to this point. And he said, and this is an interesting analogy, he said, when I was sorting through these worldviews, it was almost like looking through a box of wires, and Christianity was like a live wire that shocked back. It was the only one that did. So in some regard, he was convinced intellectually that God existed. So he started going to church, and that was a strange experience for him. He had never been. He said he sat in the auditorium for about 6 months as what he said was a hopeful agnostic, that something more was there. So because his mind was always going, and he would never have all the questions answered, he decided that if he decided to accept Christianity, that he could always go back, and just get on another breadcrumb trail, as he called it. But there was a moment when he made that decision. He said, I really just wanted to know if God was real. I knew he was true. I just wanted to know if he was real. And he said, and so that's the moment that I prayed. And I'll read a little bit of this to you. He said, I thought I had strong philosophical and scientific evidence that something existed. It was like walking up to the door of the house. It was like I know something lives there, but I have no idea what they're actually like. So my first prayer was something along the lines of, God, I have no idea who you are or what you are, and I'm not sure 100% that you exist. But if you do, I want to know more about you. And the response, he said, was a profoundly overwhelming spiritual experience. And he talks about, and I won't read it all to you, but it's pretty incredible. He talks about if you're walking in through a door and you don't know what's going to be there, but you know that there's someone extremely powerful and present. He said it was almost like as if you see a picture or a photo of a sunset and you pull down the edge, and then all of a sudden you get the reality, the real behind the picture. And he talks about how overwhelmingly powerful and how overwhelmingly good this presence was. And he said, talk about an existential crisis. He was so powerful. It was almost as if I knew he could uncreate me. But there was a goodness along with the power, and it was just overwhelming to him. He said the profound realness of it was overwhelming for him. So that when he came out of this experience and what it was, he said, I could call myself a Christian. So God had, in a sense, shown up in answer to his prayer to show him himself. And he was utterly convinced. When I saw him, it was about or about 4 years later, he was working at that same church. He was making apologetics films and doing all manner of things. He was teaching and doing incredible things for that church in terms of an apologetics ministry. But he was utterly convinced by everything altogether. But again, I think what's important for this story, for our purposes, of course, God superintended the whole process. But one thing that actually turned him in the direction of Christ was actually meeting an intelligent Christian, someone who had actually done their homework, who could converse in a very intelligent way, could not be called stupid by the atheist. Like all the others that he had dismissed. So I think for our purposes, I would affirm, knowing what we believe to be true and why, and very deeply, especially for those who are very thoughtful about their worldviews. And just as an aside or an extra, when I asked on survey what was the most compelling, or what were the most compelling pieces of rational evidence that were convincing for you as you were moving towards Christianity, the most compelling was the historical person and resurrection of Christ. And of course, the second is the beginning of the universe demands a cause, the Kalam cosmological argument, and then the moral argument was stood there. What I will say about the moral argument is that really seemed to be a very pivotal sticking point in terms of unable to find objective morality within an atheistic worldview for a few. It just really haunted them. Of course, truth, beauty, and goodness were convincing to others. And for some, the rational argument wasn't, initially at least, convincing, that there were other things that were drawing them towards Christ. Any thoughts about this story? Any observations?
Yeah,
Question?
Jana,
Yes.
I have a question. Just curious, what country was Jeremy from?
Jeremy is from the U.S., from the northwest part of the U.S.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah. So, some parts of the U.S., there's very little in the way of exposure to Christianity.
Yeah, I'm from Oregon, so I understand that.
Well, I think he's probably very close to where you were from.
Maybe I know him.
I can't say. And by the way, the names that I'm using are all pseudonyms because of the nature of anonymity of the study. So anyway, so his name really isn't Jeremy. So we'll move to another kind of atheism. When somebody says there's no evidence for God, and then you ask them the question, if Christianity was true, would you believe it? And they would still say no. Then you know that there's perhaps something else going on below the surface of rationality. Perhaps, at least in this case, they didn't believe that God was good. And so there was no way that they could believe in a God like that, essentially. So let's take a look at Gary's story. Gary thought that belief in God was irrelevant, that Christian faith was false, antiquated, superstitious. In his words, a big bag of nothing. God was mocked, not relevant at all. It was just a joke, weird to him. He had no regard for it at all. So the intellectual aspect or piece of his puzzle didn't play. Really, as he was growing up, he grew up in a nominal Catholic culture. He and his friends both made fun of it, didn't like it, were forced to go perhaps on Christmas and Easter, but really didn't think there was much there. They just thought it was a joke. It was weird. As far as his home is concerned, he grew up in a home with a father who was an alcoholic. And Gary was a twin. He was the younger of the twins, and the older boy was treated almost like a golden child and was very doted on and beloved by the father. But for some reason, Gary wasn't. He was treated very poorly by his father. He suffered emotional and physical abuse at the hand of his father, and he felt very, very unloved by his dad. And so a real sense of emotional abandonment, or he just wasn't getting what he wanted from his father. So and what happened to him experientially, unfortunately, is that when you have that lack in your life, and he was in his neighborhood, there was a neighbor who perhaps recognized this or somehow knew this and befriended Gary and really took advantage of that trust and ended up sexually abusing Gary. And he said when that happened, he said things for him just got really dark. He said, I was very sad and shipwrecked inside. He became very numb relationally to his family, to everyone. He seemed to have lost whatever joy he had in his life was gone. He felt very unloved and unlovable. He developed a sense of, I know it's the pain that he was suffering inside. He had a very strong sense of rage and anger in him, and so that he couldn't really tolerate people very well. So he just kept himself distanced. So he had this sense of real personal pain that led to doubt and disappointment with God. His words are pretty significant. Here he would say, these people would talk about, oh, God loves you. These messages might creep in, and I would be like, if he loves you, there's no way this happens. This is ridiculous. There's no way. These people are just dense. If there was a God who loved us, then I wouldn't feel the way I felt. If it was real, things wouldn't work like this. I wouldn't have an alcoholic father. I wouldn't go through the stuff you have to go through with an alcoholic parent. He said, you're just on your own. I was estranged from my father. So this idea that there is a loving heavenly father, it didn't compute at all for me. And he went on to talk about he became a very angry, tough kid who did not engage. And the way that he was able to work through his anger was to become a wrestler. Because he said when he would get on the wrestling mat and the whistle would sound, it would almost be like a switch would flip, and the anger and rage in him would just pour out, and he could pin somebody who said his own age within 15 seconds. Well, this, of course, was not lost on his coach. In order to challenge him, they matched him with bigger and stronger and older boys. And this is at the time he was 14, until he became outmatched. And he found himself flat on his back with his neck broken in 4 places. Now, that wasn't the moment when he turned to God. That was actually a moment that turned him further from God. And he didn't realize at the time, believe it or not, that his neck was broken. It was about 4 weeks later until he finally went to the hospital and had some tests that they saw that he had a broken neck. And he was in the hospital, on a hospital bed. And the catalyst for him is a little nurse named Dolores. Dolores was his caretaker, and she served him well, took care of his body, but there was something in her, obviously, that knew that there was something broken inside of him as well as his neck. And so she said, he said to her, he said, this first morning in the hospital, this nurse wakes me up, Dolores, and she says, would you mind if I prayed for you? And he said, I don't want you to do that. I don't believe in God. And she grabs my hand and starts praying for me in a very, very kind way. She just kind of smiled and took my hand, and she bowed her head and started praying. And I was looking at her, and it was a really sweet prayer. Like, she was a sweet, sweet person. And I was really touched by that. And I don't know why. It wasn't like she was forcing herself on me, and I felt uncomfortable, but there was something very good about her. And then she finishes her prayer and she goes, "Do you mind if I read you the Bible?" And I said, I told you, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the Bible. And she goes, "Well, that's okay." And she just read to me every morning, right? She just thought I was going to die. So she's sharing Christ with me, just so kind and encouraging. And 3 days later, his aunt and uncle came, and they had become Christians, and they brought him a Bible, and he opened it up, and there was a verse highlighted. It happened to be Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It was the same thing that the nurse Dolores had read to him, and he thought to himself, "My nurse just read that a couple of days ago," and that's why I was like, wow. And when that happened, I was like, there's something going on. And so that night he said his first prayer. And his prayer was, "If you're out there," kind of prayer. And in the meantime, his father accepted Christ through a Billy Graham crusade on the television. And by the time he got home, the church was really ministering to his family, bringing meals, serving them in every way that they could. By the time he got to church, he was still skeptical but open. And he said, and I think this is probably another very, very pivotal person that the Lord brought into his life. It was the youth pastor at the church. The way that he describes him, he said, "God sent me the best older brother you could ever hope for." He said he kind of looked like Jesus, but nobody, he said he would come pick me up on his motorcycle and say, "You want to go get a Slurpee and just talk?" No one had ever talked to me this way, like what I love to do, what I dream of doing. He had started playing basketball, and because he couldn't play any other sport, and this pastor would come and watch him play and say, "Man, do I love to watch you play." He would say all the right things that a father would say. And he said he was so safe for me. He didn't want anything from me. He didn't ever try to make a weird move on me. He was like the greatest, and I needed the greatest person you ever met, because I had been so wounded by people who should have loved me and shouldn't have betrayed me. These evil people that would beat you up and choke you out. Here, God just literally sent an angel. And he goes on to talk about how he helped him understand really what Christianity was about, who God was, who Christ was, and it was in a way that he could really understand. And what's interesting about his story, too, is that he, of course, was loved by these people, and he was shown Christ in an embodied way. But he also had to know that it was true. He wasn't willing to learn to accept Christ because it felt good. So he ended up looking at the evidences, looking at apologetics, and coming to a place of sound faith. But again, the pivotal part in his story was that this is a young man who was wounded, and he was met with love. And that showed him the goodness of God and the goodness of Christ before he was willing to understand whether or not it was true. And he said the way that Dolores treated him is the way that he treats people today. If you saw him, he's a very big kind of very imposing physique. He's got a shaved head, kind of Mr. Clean, if you want to envision that. He's got a very powerful voice and a dominant personality, but yet he meets people in truth, but also in incredible love. He wants to know their story. He wants to know who they are, and he just he's an extraordinary guy. Any thoughts about this kind of conversion or what you've observed from this story?
Jana, we actually have some questions from earlier, and they don't go with this story, but Marcus asked, were only ex-atheists interviewed in the study?
Only, yes, only ex-atheists.
And then we have a question from Carmelito. He said that the actual truth of the matter is that most atheists do not deal with facts at all. Is that statement right?
Oh, I find that hard to believe. I think that that's a very strong blanketed statement. That's like saying all Christians are stupid, and none of them look at evidence either. So some are very, very thoughtful about the things that they believe. I mean, I think some are truly convinced that the atheistic worldview is intellectually credible. In fact, the next person that I'm going to be talking about said that it gave him an intellectual home. Now, again, how willing they were to deal with or cope with the implications of their own worldview, or even look at the reality of facts from a Christian worldview, that's a different story. But everyone is very different. Some are genuinely on an intellectual search, they just haven't found it. Some genuinely aren't on an intellectual search and don't want to have anything to do with facts and data, especially if it goes against what they want to be true. So I would say that, at least for the atheist in my study, and these are the only ones that I can really speak to, is that on some level they really were, just like the first guy that I talked about. He was willing to do the hard work of looking at facts and evidence and to see where the evidence led, and it led him to the soundness of the Christian worldview.
Okay, the next question's from William. He said, with regard to agnostics who might believe in the existence of God, but that knowing anything about him is impossible and therefore religion is stupid, would you say that most of this information would apply to them as well, or do you think there's enough of a difference that the approach should be different?
I think the approach should be a little bit different, and the next story is really more the apathetic, the one that thinks that God isn't relevant and the belief in God is stupid. So do you want me to go forward with this story, and then we'll wrap up with whatever question you have, because this is okay. So my last story, God isn't relevant, Christians are not attractive. That is the stereotype. It's not something plausible nor attractive, and somehow it's countered by an attractive embodied faith. In some regard, that's part of the story in terms of building plausibility for the Christian worldview. But let's listen to his story. We're talking with Greg this time. For Greg, God was dangerous. It was embarrassing belief. It's mere social belief. Belief in God is absurd. It's just a social construction. Christianity is not relevant. It's false, antiquated, superstitious. For him, it's for weak people, weak intellectuals. It's just fabricated myth. The Bible is ignorant commentary. Greg's backstory: he grew up, he was an avid, he was, I'm sorry, it's almost midnight for me. He was an avid astronomer. I didn't want to say astrologer. He was an avid astronomer. He grew up reading Carl Sagan's books. He thought of himself as scientifically minded. Experientially, he grew up in a nominal Catholic home, and he went to church because he was forced to. He went through confirmation. He thought it was weird and strange, and he just couldn't wait to get out. He said one of the most disingenuous things he's ever done, and one of his biggest regrets, was actually going through with confirmation knowing that he didn't believe any of it. He was just doing it to please his parents and because of the social pressure of it. So experientially, he had a very bad taste in his mouth about religion and what he had experienced. By the time he really didn't give religion much thought at all. After confirmation, he never went back to church. By the time he got to college and he started on the internet, he found a guy named Dan Barker who ran the Freedom from Religion Foundation. You probably know who he is. He's a former evangelical pastor, now avid evangelist for atheism, basically. And he found himself an intellectual home with Dan Barker and this foundation. He went into what he called as a militant type of atheism. He was highly contemptuous of Christians and Christianity. He wanted nothing to do with it other than to put it down and to ridicule it and to wipe it off the face of the earth. From a moral perspective, he loved atheism because it gave him what he called a moral blank check. It gave him freedom to do whatever he wanted to do, and he enjoyed that. He said, I could do whatever I wanted, and it really served him well. He liked the intellectual superiority of atheism. He liked how it fed him, again, intellectually, as well as allowing him to live whatever life he wanted morally. In the meantime, he marries a Christian woman from a Christian family who is very non-pushy about her religion or her faith at all. She has what he called relational patience. So he was living with a Christian, but in his 20s particularly, very strongly atheistic. So I'm not sure how they connected, but there you go. By the time he reached his 30s, though, he began to fatigue, both intellectually. It didn't seem to give him the satisfaction that it did at one time, where he was kind of lording it over the religious believer. It also didn't give him the moral satisfaction that it did anymore. His life, he started some sense of reflection about who he was. He says his morality was he said, it wasn't anything I saw a problem behind until years later, in descending into lower and lower levels of depravity. The way the things I did to people, the way I betrayed people, the things I gave myself license to do that were really, really horrific in a lot of ways. He said, you can go on forever in terms of creating your own morality. You can excuse anything if you want, or if you have a mind to do it. But that started to become a break to what I was doing, and I was just reflecting on, what am I doing? Who am I becoming? So he called it self-loathing, that he was having this insight into himself that was not good. He was seeing the ugliness of his own moral depravity and moral choices, but he had nowhere to go with that. That's the worldview that he was in. But he also, at the same time, began to feel a strong sense of the futility of life. He said in his early 30s, he entered a new phase to where he didn't see any alternative for atheism, but he didn't delight in it either. It felt like a very empty worldview that didn't bring any comfort or joy and life. It just seemed hopeless at that point. And he goes on to talk about the meaninglessness of life and how it was just like, you go to work every day and it's like building a sandcastle that's going to be wiped away by the ocean, and then you die, and what's it all for? And it was just this meaninglessness and this futility caused him a sense of real kind of existential despair. He said, I found nothing in this worldview, and it started causing problems for me in my relationships, my habits, the ways I was treating people. And so he came to a place where he was willing to see and recognize that his own worldview wasn't big enough for his world, in a sense, that something was missing. Actually, a lot was missing in his world. Even though he had what he thought he wanted. He said the fear of nothingness, of emptiness, of meaninglessness, it was a huge driver, especially the meaninglessness. At some point, he said it made me a lot more open to listen. It was a humbling process. I had to ask myself, am I willing to consider another point of view, and that mine has nothing to offer? The futility of life as an atheist was something that really laid the groundwork for me to investigate something else. So he had rejected God. He was rationally superior. He had a contempt for religion. He was surrounded by a person, his wife and her family, who seemed to embody or inhabit a kind of simple joy in living. He said they didn't have very much in life in terms of this world, but they always were kind. They were very generous. They were not cynical. They seemed to handle and roll with the ups and downs of life in a way that he I guess, admired from a distance. But he never really wanted it because he didn't want their religion. He was too smart for that. Well, the catalyst came one day when his wife's grandmother became ill and she died. And so they went to a funeral, and it got him thinking about death and what that means and what that means for him. And that evening after the Mass, his wife, who was a Christian, actually brought her Bible to their bedside, and they had a habit of reading the Bible every night. But he said he had never seen her do that, and she just wanted to see more closely or read again some of the passages that the priest had read. Well, with that Bible up there, he was contemplating death. He wondered what the Bible had to say about death, and he thought that he knew what the gospel were in the Gospels because he'd been through confirmation. So he started immediately in Acts. And he said he was totally undone and very taken by what he read. He said, I just started reading, and I read and read and read. I kept reading, read through the letters, and he said, I was completely amazed. It caused me to go, whoa, nobody told me about this. I've never heard about these kind of testimonies, the sermons they preached, the journeys they made spreading the gospel. It was really amazing that they would die for what they believed and commit their entire lives to it. He was very impressed with the person of Paul, that he was such an intelligent character that he didn't think that anyone like that would be associated or in the Bible. It was, he said he read the whole New Testament in 3 to 4 months. He was very impressed with the person of Jesus and how his sense of his self-understanding, how he didn't back down, so compelling, so amazing, etc. And so he became very taken by the scripture, but then he started to question whether or not it was true, whether it was worth believing intellectually, because he could not forsake himself in terms of his own intellect. So he started researching historical reliability of scripture and a lot of apologetics until he came to the point where he believed that Christianity was true. But again, believing something's true is very different from feeling of having a felt need or willing to commit your life to something or someone, really. So he was contemplating all this. He was on a business trip over a few weeks, and later he found himself in front of a cathedral, a very, very large Canadian cathedral. And he had an encounter there, which he would call a spiritual experience, a spiritual encounter that really brought him to his knees. It was very humbling. If we've got time later, I'll read it. But for the most part, it was so convincing to him. It was what brought him to believe and to become a Christian. And I asked him the question after he became a Christian. I said, did you find a meaningful life, a more meaningful life, or the life that you were looking for that wasn't in atheism. And he said, yes, there is meaning to life, and it's incredible. And sometimes it seems like it's almost too good, and I still struggle with it. It is something too amazing to believe to be true. It goes on and on about it, and how and Jesus, and it's so incredible, and da 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 da, and it gives you such hope. And I just want to be able to have it inform the way I live. I want to be able to live that every day. And when I spoke with him, he's in a very desolate area in terms of Christians and Christianity. He's very much an outsider from his culture, but he's studying, he's teaching apologetics there, and he's become an incredible witness in his part of the world, I guess you could say. But again, what was the catalyst here? There were a couple, and one is that he saw a living embodied Christianity in front of him. There's someone in the study who was talking about how unless you can see it, a portrait of it, a lived reality of Christianity, sometimes it's really hard to imagine yourself as a Christian. But for him, he saw it in the life of his family and in the life of his wife, so that by the time he had this felt need, he knew that there was something else that was different he had seen embodied, and then he started investigating for himself. He saw how it really provided everything that atheism was missing. But at the end of the day, and I'll try to wrap it up here, and we'll answer questions. When I looked at both survey data and interview data, so that's why there's some discrepancy in the numbers. But for the most part, what opened the door for the atheists to even consider Christianity was more that it was good. There was something good about it. There was something relevant about it. It wasn't an intellectual argument. It was for a few. I can tease out that number for you if you want, but when I looked at the stories closely, only 26% were really initially motivated by intellectual arguments. The majority met someone who was informed, who broke a stereotype, that they were normal people. It could just be something as simple as that opened the door for them to consider the reality of looking into it further. And then there was a period of questing for many, whether they looking at the Bible, reading the Bible, and that even for some considered a spiritual experience, looking more closely at the Christian worldview, looking at the person of Jesus, being totally bowled over by the person of Jesus, finding it to be true and substantive and like they thought. And then again, but it's a completely another step to move towards conversion, that there has to be a felt need. But again, a spiritual experience is a part of this journeying as well. But at the end of the day, they would not have converted if they thought it was merely good or relevant. They had to believe wholeheartedly that God was true and real. In addition to all of the other benefits, the functional benefits that come along with faith. So at the end of the day, this is on survey, what they reported to be the most compelling reasons in the end for conversion were believing the life and claims of Jesus Christ as true and real, the evidence for the resurrection, the truth of the Bible, that actually the Christian belief is rational, and some admitted it was just a change in their willingness to be open is what brought them on towards faith. And so we're looking again at breaking down stereotypes, building plausibility of Christian faith and who God is, and it's all again through the work of the Holy Spirit, in all and through all. I think Blaise Pascal sums it up well, this more holistic understanding is of looking at conversion is make religion attractive, make good men wish it were true, and then show them that it is. After all, it's just following in the way of Jesus, the one who was and demonstrated love, truth, and life. So, okay, done. Any questions, further comments?
So Jana, we have some questions in the chat box here. One's from Shannon. She says, do you have any tips for reaching friends who are apathetic toward God and don't seem to care about Christianity?
Yeah, that's a huge issue right now. And it's when someone doesn't care, there's nothing you can do to precipitate them caring if they don't. Sometimes it's a matter, first of all, I would say I would remain relationally close, because you want to be living and embodying the person of Christ and how you're doing life differently. Like, for example, in the COVID, that you're not fearful, that you are joyful, that you're trusting, that you're going with the flow, you're being productive, you're finding it an opportunity to do and more accomplish. You know, you're not cynical, you're not fearful, but you're staying related with the person so that when and if something comes along. And it's interesting in looking at all of the religion conversion models, that most of them had some sort of crisis point. Now, you can't manufacture a crisis. It might be an illness in their life or something, you know, that they're confronting, a loss of some sort. It may be more like this last guy, where they just have to come to the end of themselves in their lives, where their life is just not working the way that they thought it would. You have to be alongside to show them a better way, to be there when they are ready. I wish I could say that there was an easy answer. Definitely be praying for them, praying that they would desire something more. And of course, there are those questions that help them to think more clearly about their worldview. They may be apathetic because they think it is right, or they issue, you know, they give out slogans. Oh, it's just you know, I'm just smarter or scientific, or I really don't care. Well, why don't you care? Don't you care about your life? Does your life have meaning? You know, purpose? We're in a culture right now where everything is about how you feel and your emotions, and you know, what's your purpose or how you're creating yourself. But there's really no grounding for that apart from God. So sometimes it's helpful to have just conversations about that. So, you know, what is your purpose? What is your reason for living? You know, where do you find that? How do you know that's true? And so you start those very strategic apologetic questions about helping them tease out the realities in their own life, because that in this world with distraction and diversion and self-creation, a lot of people can't even get to those bigger truths. You know, evidence is out there in the world and the cosmos and fine-tuning and all of that, but they're willing to talk about themselves as like, you know, I really would like to have meaning or hope or have a sense of peace like you have, or whatever. What is it that's bothering them? See if you can tap into those, get them to see that, put a stone in their shoe, you know, get them to see that perhaps, you know, it's not what they think, or it's more than they know. Just develop conversations, be with them, walk alongside them.
Great, thank you. We have another question here from Carmelito. He says, is it true that pride is one reason why people will not believe God? If true, why?
Oh, wow. Pride is the nemesis of us all. Pride keeps us all from God, because in pride, we're thinking that we know better than God, right? Or it's hard when someone is prideful. They think they've got it together, and they think they have all the answers, and they can do it on their own, and they're the captain of their own ship. And so they create idols whether it's the idol of themselves, the idol of their science, or whatever, their intellect. But their idols are insufficient to produce a fully orbed worldview, to give all of the answers. I mean, if you look, I don't know if you've ever read Finding Truth by Nancy Pearcey. That's the way she begins from Romans 1, that we all create idols. When we don't want God, we suppress the truth and unrighteousness, and we pursue our own idols, and we reduce God to something, or reduce life or reality to something that's manageable, something we can control, something we think will do something good for us. But it's the height of arrogance, because we're trying to dismiss all of reality, which we cannot explain from our limited worldview and our own human autonomy. So pride, and idolatry is the opposite of belief. It's not atheism, it's pride. And that goes for us as Christians too. Anything we put in front of God is an act of pride. And we do that in our lives all the time. It's a constant struggle for us, all of us, all the time. And, especially with those who reject God and create another idol forthright.
Okay, we have 2 more questions because it's almost midnight for you. So we have one from Marcus. He said, would you be willing to do a similar study with current atheists, or have such studies been done that you would recommend looking into?
Oh, you mean current? This is a study with current atheists. These are not. These are all living, breathing beings that I connected with. Did I not explain that clearly? They're all done with. This is a contemporary study that was all done within these past few years. I'm publishing this work. If you want to read all the ins and outs of it, I'm trying to publish all the stories as well. But so your answer about a contemporary study, this is that. And what was the second part?
Have such studies been done that you would recommend looking into?
I will say one of the reasons why I selected this as a study is because of the lack in the literature. There's one other guy who has done a cursory study of contemporary narratives or testimonies, online testimonies of atheist conversion. But apart from that, this is the only study that I know of a group of atheists coming to faith and atheists coming to faith in Christianity. That's why one of the reasons I was able to do it, because it's a novel contribution to the literature. It's just not out there, which is really, really surprising. But it's also what makes this work kind of exciting. And as far as, what I could recommend, just the one resource. His name is Joseph Langston, I believe. If you want to, he does a lot of work in looking at atheism, generally speaking. And he did one little, like I say, kind of cursory study by looking at online narratives and trying to draw a few conclusions from that.
All right, this is going to be the last one for the night. This is from Jember. He says, according to Stephen Hawking, we have 4 fundamental forces of nature which happen to be caused by a series of causes. This is one of the reasons why atheists don't want to believe in a personal creator of the universe. How can you address this kind of question? Thank you.
I'm not sure that I can, other than I'm not that familiar with Stephen Hawking's work. So I can't speak to that very specifically, other than I know that when you look at, for example, John Lennox's work, and I would really encourage you to look at John Lennox's response to Stephen Hawking when he says statements like philosophy is dead, when he's spouting philosophy. There are certain things and elements and logic in Stephen Hawking's way of thinking that really undermines his whole premise. What was Stephen Hawking's book? Was it The Grand Design? Or I'm not exactly sure which one it is, but John Lennox has I would really encourage you. It's a lovely, very small book that rebuts Stephen Hawking's premises. And he does a beautiful job of showing how the illogic of Stephen Hawking's thinking. And now I'm not really sure if it addresses the four causes particularly, but I would encourage you to go there. I'm afraid I would do myself a great disservice to try to answer that question for you.
Well, that was the last question, Jana. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
You guys could turn on your mics and say thank you if you want.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. If any of you want to follow up with any further questions, I'm always available. Just ask Jane. She can connect with me.
All right.
Do we have time can you explain the spiritual encounter of the atheist who married that Christian woman? You said if you had time.
Okay, do you want me to read his little
Really quickly.
Yes. Yeah, you can sign off if you don't want to stay, but okay, let's see. Where did I put it? Okay, here we go. He said, I was downtown Montreal, and Montreal is a very old city, and there are many old cathedrals downtown, and I was just walking through one of the city streets, and there was this beautiful cathedral. It was French. It was just enormous, and I thought I would go inside to see it, and I don't know, reflect or think. I don't know what I was doing. I don't know what God was doing. It had huge granite steps leading up to it, and there was a beggar sitting on the stairs leading up to the entrance, and he was begging for change in French, so I didn't understand him. He must have asked me for change, and I think I just dismissed him. I think I said, no, I can't help you. And I walked right past him. And I was at the end of the cathedral, and there were a series of double doors, master bronze double doors going across all along the entrance, all along the front of it. So I was trying each set in turn to get in, and they were locked. So I was opening one, and then I would walk down 10 feet and open another set. And it wasn't until I got till and all of them were locked. And I got down to, and sorry, I'm just reading his words exactly. And I got down to, I skipped past a set, and I went down to the end where they were locked. And I heard someone say, come. And I turned around, and the beggar was there. And he was holding open the double doors for me. And I was so immediately convicted in my heart right at that moment. It wasn't just that he was holding the doors open for me, but even then, at that moment, I realized that this was the grace of God for me. He was opening the door to relationship with him. And I was just so convicted at that moment with all of the sin in my life. Looking into the face of this man, I was so ashamed of myself. I couldn't look him in the eye, and I was just like, thank you. And I walked in. I was just so ashamed of my own sinfulness at that point. And I don't know. It was just like, I have to believe that he was sent from God. I don't know. I'm sure that man had been there for his whole life, but at that moment, it had to have been. I was just so convinced of it. It was just so humbling. And for him, I can't get in on my own, but God opens the door through the most humble man, the most simple man. And there were so many levels that I could see. It just seems so biblical to me that God would humble me with this man I had just dismissed in my haste to go to a church. The irony of it was not lost on me. It was pretty intense. I think I sat inside for 40 minutes to an hour in the silence, just reflecting on it, going, well, and I prayed to God, and I just said, I'll accept. And I don't know how I did it, and I don't remember the words that I said, but that was the beginning of it for me. It was amazing. It was beautiful. It was great. Yeah, it was pretty cool. So he looked at this as a spiritual encountering. Now, it's a different kind of encountering than what Jeremy experienced in this kind of grand, overwhelming way, which there were those. There were those spiritual experiences, and I actually teased these out in my study in terms of those which felt to be an internal conviction of God versus an external kind of providential circumstance. In this case, it's a bit of both. There was that the spiritual nature of the event itself, the placement of the man, that, where he saw God's spiritual enacting of that circumstance, that occurrence, everything that happened about it, as well as his own internal conviction was spiritual in nature. So, that was that.
Great, thank you so much. And I think this is where we will conclude the meeting now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Jane.
Thank you for staying up so late with us. I know you're on the East Coast, so we really appreciate it.
Oh, that's great. That's no problem. Okay.